Welcome to the How to Stop Dieting podcast, the info you need to know to stop yo-yo dieting. Thanks for joining me. Before we move on, make sure to leave a like or a comment, subscribe, and share it with a friend if you find this podcast or any of the other podcasts helpful. As always, I'll be leaving any links that I talk about in today's episode in the show's notes. Our episode, we're going to talk about the idea of how to know if you're not eating enough to lose weight. This is something that when I'm talking with people on brainstorms or when I'm just having chats, the subtext of the conversation kind of goes in the direction of, I feel like I'm struggling to stick to my diet, I'm not losing any weight, and I feel like really the reason I'm not losing any weight is because I'm not eating enough. So for those that are here for the TLDR version of this, basically that's not true, right? There are some very specific starvation studies that we've seen that where they took people, put them in prisoner of war conditions, fed them down to the point that they were going through starvation, and they lost weight the whole way through. In controlled conditions, people lose weight. The fact that you can't not lose weight if you're not eating enough. Math doesn't work out. Eventually the body will break some stuff down. This is where it gets confusing, is because people have misunderstandings, or they don't have the full picture of whatever it is that they're thinking about when they make this statement. They're throwing a bunch of ideas together, or maybe they're just even parroting what they've heard other people say before, because that's what we do as human beings, right? And so let's talk about this kind of concept a little bit deeper. I think a great example, though, before we go into the deepness of it, is I like to think about that question, and it's like, all right, if that were true, why do we not see examples of it other places in the world, right? If we here in Western cultures, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, US, if we see in those cultures people struggling with obesity or gaining body fat, and we see them struggling to not eat enough and they gain body fat, how come we don't see this in other places in the world? Third world countries are a great example of this. We see a lot of them struggling with starvation, right? There's so much of the world where overfeeding is a problem, and there's so much of the world where underfeeding is a problem. Starvation is a problem. And in these starving third world countries, we don't see a lot of obesity where they're actually starving. We do see obesity there, don't get me wrong, it can definitely exist there, but we don't see in those conditions where they don't have any food at all, we don't see starving communities looking obese. We see the opposite. We see malnutrition, we see undernutrition. And so the easiest example that I think for this is, if that were true, why does someone in Africa struggle to lose weight when here in Australia, New Zealand, USA, why do we struggle to lose weight not eating enough, right? So it doesn't really make sense that we don't see it there. And it doesn't make sense if we don't see it there and in controlled studies we don't see it, right? So when people are in free world conditions, that means we're under our own control. That's where people think they see this happen. There's so many reasons for this. And the first one is that we're just not designed to understand or estimate our food intake really well. Really, we're designed to do a whole bunch of other things, but that is probably the worst one that we can do. Our brain doesn't have a calorie calculator, doesn't have any way for us to measure the energy of food coming in. There's no way for us to know the nutrients that we're getting from food. And because of that, we have no way of knowing inside of us internally saying okay, I've had 1,000 calories today. I only need a couple hundred more to be, good or whatever to lose weight. We don't have that. Our brain operates on references. It compares experiences, contrasts those experiences with another time that it's been similar to, and we delve the information from that, right? So last time that you ate a meal this big, how much calories were there in that, or how dense was that meal, or how filling was that meal, what did I get from that meal? The brain draws on those experiences to imprint on what we're going to expect to experience this time around. And so from that, we can have misunderstandings on things, and there's no way for us to get this self-check that goes along the way to say, hey, how much have we actually consumed here? And there's this brilliant study, I believe there's a few now, but there's at least one that I'm thinking of off the top of my head, where the dietitians and nutritionists who do this job, where they underreport as well. People who are experienced around this and teach this underreport. And this is because it's just how bad we are. Humans are just really bad at guessing with our eyeballs about the food intake that we're having without having some education around it. Now, the dietitians and the nutritionists were closer than everyone else, but they weren't close enough to be inaccurate, right? So we see this kind of error in when people are doing this. So per se, it's just not a human designed trait for us to be good at this. And so therefore kind of expecting ourselves to be good at it is a little bit unfair, and it builds this belief inside of us that maybe something's wrong with me because my understanding is of this food that it's about 1,000 calories. When I eat that, my body gains weight or whatever, when really we don't understand that it's probably 1,500, 2,000, whatever it may be. So that's tends to be the first thing when it comes to this. And one of the others that we tend to see from this idea of not eating enough to lose weight is the idea of our body slowing down. We call anyone that loses weight, they can eventually over time will show this resistance to losing weight. And that's true. It definitely does happen. The scientific term for it is what we call metabolic adaptation, and basically means our metabolism adjusts to the lowered intake, and therefore our body has less energy coming in, and it does less with that energy in a way to try and preserve the fat that we have stored so that we don't break that down and lose it. Now, that adaptation is not that much. It's really like we're talking 7 to 13%, depending on how obese a person was, how much body fat they lost, and over what time period. But really, when we're thinking about something like that, 7 to 13%, 13% can be quite high, but we tend to see that in people that have gone through like the Biggest Loser type, weight loss trials or challenges where over 3 months they've lost 50 to 60, 70, 80, and 90 pounds or whatever. We don't see this for the vast majority of weight loss, which tends to be 5 to 10 pounds of someone's body weight over a 12-week time period. That's generally what most people lose over a 12-week time period. Now, there are those that lose much faster and they may feel a little bit more of that adaptation, but for the majority of people, if 13%-ish of the metabolic adaptation that's happening is for those extremes of weight loss over 12 weeks, then if we scale that down and think about what the average person's losing, somewhere in that 5, 10, 15 pounds over 12 weeks, maybe 20 pounds, we're thinking about, a very smaller number, closer to 7% down regulation than you would think 13. At least think about it kind of like a scale like that, right? So when we think about that number, imagine your metabolism's, 1,200 calories or whatever. 7% of 1,200 calories isn't that much to lose anything, right? So we're talking about maybe, whatever it is, that's math on it right here. So 7% of down regulation is like 84 calories, right? So you go from 1,200 calories for your resting metabolic rate down to 84 calories minus that. So you're looking at like 1,120 something calories instead of 1,200. 80 calories, right? 80 calories is a few bites of something. It's like a snack, like half a snack or something like that. So in terms of the food density of the foods that we commonly eat, 80 calories is nothing. It doesn't add up to being much or anything like that. It doesn't equate to the math that we see people slow down on their weight loss. It doesn't make sense, that math of seeing someone down-regulate 84 calories or so from their body to enough to cause them significant, slowdown and stuff like that. So when we start thinking about the physical stuff, the math on this stuff, it makes logical sense that this stuff doesn't happen. So where is it happening? What tends to be the biggest areas that people struggle with when it comes to this? Well, a large portion of it is psychological. If we have this perception that when we diet, we slow ourselves down, or our body fights back and it doesn't want to lose weight and it struggles and stuff like that, it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We see things that confirm this, right? Our brain does this really well. It's a type of bias that we have to make sure that our world makes sense. And so some people call it like yellow punch buggy bias or whatever. I think if you type into Google those types of biases, you'll see examples of this coming up, right? I call it the Tesla bias, right? I love Teslas. I think they're really cool. And so now every time I'm driving, I see them everywhere and I notice them everywhere. And our brain does the same thing. It cuts out all the other information of all the other cars I'm seeing. And now I tend to think, wow, there's so many Teslas on the road. And I can see myself falling for this bias because I enjoy seeing Teslas. Same deal if you tell yourself that you're going to see your body slow down, you're going to struggle when it comes to fat loss, you're going to have your body fight back, you're going to find it really hard. By telling yourself that, we start to feel that. We start to look for examples where that's kind of true. Therefore, we pull back on our efforts and execution on things. In large part, there's psychological consequences of this. When we start to say to ourselves, I expect myself to struggle on a diet, we start to struggle on a diet. And so our language is really, it does beget our actions, thoughts, and emotions. So if we do some stuff to change the language and our expectations around it, our world also changes around it as well. And it starts to become easier to then seek the changes or be consistent with those changes rather than fighting against them. Psychologically, it tends to be the biggest pushback. there is a small sense in doing what we call refeeding, or doing what we call like increasing someone's calories so that they do start losing weight. And this is kind of how it works. So imagine you're eating, 1,500 calories to diet, and you're really, really struggling. You need 2,000 calories to maintain your activity, and you're going down to 1,500 calories. So 2,000 to maintain, 1,500 calories is what you're eating. So you should have a 500 calorie deficit. Say that's enough, that 500 calorie deficit is enough to start causing your body to downregulate, right? So it notices that you're under eating, the feedback mechanisms kick in, and the body fights back. And so you see that 7% slow down, right? Instead of eating 2,000 calories and eating 1,500 calories, you're giving your body less energy. So we see stuff like when you're training, there's just less energy to be accommodated towards training. It's really hard for you to do a 300 calorie training session when you're eating 2,000 calories. That's easy. Your body's got a lot of energy to push that energy towards that and to encourage that to happen. But if you're eating 1,500 calories, it's very hard for the body to cover all its bases that it needs for its daily tasks and functions and all the things that goes on just to regulate itself, and also keep up that training intensity, right? There's feedbacks and inhibitors and stuff like that to try and slow that down. So we tend to see when we lower people's food too much, their activity tends to drop and their training output tends to drop as well, just by proxy of having not enough energy. Now, there's not a direct way to capture this or measure this and stuff like this, and most of the means of it are poor in terms of accuracy. But we can just start to see it in terms of like either fatigue, like internal experiences of fatigue accumulating a lot faster afterwards, or injuries and stuff like that appearing a little bit faster. Technically, I guess you could look at stuff like Apple Watch outputs or watch outputs and stuff like that, though they're very inaccurate. We tend to see with those outputs that those numbers and stuff tend to drop as well. As much as it's not a great indicator, you can still get some indication from it. When we take someone's food down from 2,000 down to 1,500, not just training drops, but we see what this area of our metabolism called NEAT drop as well. And NEAT stands for non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And basically it means everything that we're doing that's not formal activity as a part of our metabolism outside of resting and stuff like that. So our NEAT would be fidgeting while we're talking. It would be walking around the house doing things. It would be going to the shops. It'd be walking upstairs, right? It'd be all the tasks that we do that we don't even think about doing as a part of our day just to get things done. And so when we go from eating 2,000 calories to 1,500 calories, not only is exercise compromised, but that area of our metabolism where we do all that, spontaneous stuff, that tends to drop down as well. So we see people doing less movement across their day. When we think about a training session, generally a training session is 30 minutes to maybe an hour and a half, the average being about an hour. We see that drop down in a small proportion as well. We don't have like set numbers on what it does drop down by, but we see it drop down. But when we think about that, one training session is only 30 to 60 minutes of our day. But the rest of our day, the rest of our daily activity, that could be up to 16 hours. So if we start to see 16 hours of our day starting to be impacted, that's where people forget, or like our brain doesn't perceive that change. But there's a massive drop in energy there. So, we can have people doing a bunch of activity that they don't even realize that they're doing by just being moving throughout the day, walking around, doing stuff, to doing less of that without our brain actually capturing it and saying, hey, there's a difference here. Now, I might give some examples here, and you can think about some of those times and go, right, I think I've done this stuff before. I've noticed that I've had this happen before. So we get less movement in our hands. We get less, we do less of that stuff. Instead of standing, we tend to find reasons or opportunities to sit down. Instead of sitting down, we tend to find other reasons to lie down. Instead of lying down, we try and find sleeping. Think about a time where you've been dieting and you felt that need, that you're just feeling tired across, like a total fatigue across the rest of the day outside of the training stuff. And instead of walking around, you felt like, oh, I'll just sit down for a little bit, or I'll put my feet up for a little bit, or like I'm really feeling the diet at the moment. I'm feeling really run down. Those thoughts, those experiences, and then the stuff that we do around that are all ways that our metabolism drops down. If you needed 2,000 calories to maintain what you were doing before, and now you're eating 1,500 calories, and so you're trying to burn 500 calories, that's the difference between that 1,500 and the 2,000 calories. So you're hoping that 500 calories was going to translate into a pound of body fat across a week. That downregulation that we see happening, though it might not just be 7% from there, that we see what we call low metabolic flux. And basically this means our body does less stuff throughout the time because we have less energy going into it. What would necessarily be a 500 calorie deficit because we were eating 2,000 to maintain, and now we've dropped to 1,500 to encourage that fat loss. That fat loss actually gets less and less and less because our energy to maintain our activity for our day has now come down because we're actually eating so much less that we found ways to lower the amount of activity that we're doing throughout the day. And so if we lower activity across the day and we lower training activity, we're looking at 16 hours of total daily activity that's being impacted. So we're seeing that come down drastically. And so this is where people can get this idea of, if I don't eat enough, I don't lose weight. And that's true, but it's not that everything else remains static. It's that as you take that food down, your body adjusts with it. And there's like this, you're burning less calories. So that 500 calorie deficit that we were talking about before would probably become somewhere between a 200 and 300 calorie deficit. And so therefore the timeline that you should burn, drop a pound of body fat obviously starts to extend out. You start to see longer timelines for this. When we think about these things, what's actually going on underneath the hood when people go, right, when I can't eat enough or when I don't eat enough, my body doesn't lose weight. And therefore I should eat more to lose weight. Now, the opposite side of low metabolic flux is this concept of high metabolic flux, which is if I feed someone, say they need 2,000 to maintain, let's use that same example, and then I give them 2,500 calories. So now they're eating an extra 500 calories more. Well, now we can see that they're potentially being able to do more. So their training sessions may be able to improve in either length, quality, or quantity of calories burned, or whatever it is that we're kind of measuring. They may go from a 200 to a 300 calorie session to a 400 or 500 calorie session. So therefore they're burning that output. So say they've gone up from 2,000 to 2,500, there's an extra 200 calories there that their body's now burning in terms of that as well. There's increases in what we call thermic effect of food. So our body's metabolism of food. If you go from eating 2,000 calories to 2,500 calories, you burn another 50 calories on your metabolism just by eating more food. So there's a little bit of extra loss in that food from just our body breaking down and metabolizing things. And so we're seeing extra areas for eating more food to help you do more things actually helps you burn the same amount of body fat, but not feel that run down, not feel lethargic, tired and whatnot. So we tend to see that being an example, high metabolic flux or low metabolic flux being examples of when people really feel that they're not eating enough and that they're struggling to lose weight, and that by eating more, their body starts to actually lose weight. Now, we did talk about, so that's some of the physical stuff. We did talk about the psychological stuff as well, as how that can really start to play into it. And in large part, whenever someone struggles to lose weight, if we just take some time off of a diet, give them a diet break or a maintenance week, or just some time off and say, hey, let's just stop dieting for a while and focus on life and just bring that energy back up, we tend to see this stuff recover quite well. The body's really flexible around that. Eventually, most people get to that point of where they feel good and they do this long enough, they eat more food long enough that they get to a point where they're like, all right, I actively want to diet again because I feel recovered. And that's the point that you should try and aim to get to if you're thinking about trying to diet for yourself. You should allow yourself to have a diet break or maintenance week, or stop the diet for as long as you need to get back to a point where you can say, right, I'm ready to go again on a diet. Because by doing that, you're more likely to be consistent on returning to the diet than if you were to try and include stuff like cheat meals or refeeds or whatever the case may be. That kind of strategy is something that I use with my clients regularly. Okay, so we've spoken about the physical effects of not eating enough. We've spoken about starvation mode as well, starvation idea, and we've used examples from Africa. We've spoken about the physical effects of not eating enough, so low metabolic flux, not eating enough, your body down-regulating what's going on across the day, and therefore you burn less. And high metabolic flux, the same deal, being in reverse, eating more food, the body burning more things, helping you have a higher and greater total daily output, doing more walking, doing bigger training sessions, burning a little bit more from food, and therefore increasing the amount of fat that we break down just by eating some more food from this. Talked about some of the psychological effects of this as well, where if we start to give language and self-describe what we think is going to happen on a diet, like saying it's going to be hard, my body fights back and I don't like all these things, it's a struggle, then we create this self-fulfilling prophecy around that. And so we've spoken about those aspects on how we can fall under this idea of not eating enough for my body to keep losing body fat, right? I'm not eating enough food and my body stops breaking down body fat. So we can see how this is not true, but some of the reasons why it feels true when we're doing it. I don't know the exact numbers, so I'll have to look them up a little bit later and post them below or whatever the case may be. But there is a study that has showed lately that there's some downregulation that occurs when people sleep. Like we were talking about there, between the 16 hours that we're awake, when we sleep, we actually move around, and there's this component of our movement from our metabolism, of us being active throughout our sleep. And those that eat a little bit more food tend to move around, fidget around a little bit more in their sleep. And those that don't tend to not. And so, I thought was a really interesting tidbit around this. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, so I can't quote any of them. But if you're interested, you let me know and I'll find them for you and I'll post them down. Thanks very much for coming on board and listening throughout this. I know it seemed a little bit complicated. I try to use the best analogies, metaphors that I could really help so that you could walk through this with me. And hopefully, if you know someone that's really been struggling with this concept, or if you yourself have been struggling with this concept and you keep trying to eat less to keep yourself to lose more weight, you're doing the right things. Just know that there's some other things that might slow that down and make it harder for you. It's just really hard to know what to do to really figure it out for your diet. So if you are struggling with that, that makes sense, right? You are doing the right thing by trying to eat less. Eventually, we may just have to temporarily increase that for an amount of time or whatever the case may be. If you'd like someone to actually have a conversation with you and diagnose and deep dive this together with you, I do offer brainstorms. This is something that I offer freely for anyone that wants to just reach out, say, hey, look, I'm struggling with this. I really would like some insight and stuff like that. We can jump on a phone call and we can talk this through. Now, there's no obligation or no discussion or anything like that about sales. I don't force anyone to have a conversation around that. This is totally just a conversation based around what you're struggling with and how to deep dive that and get someone who's been in this industry for 8 years now, looking at it and talking with you about it and trying to give you some insights into what I think and what I've seen with all the clients that I've coached, the things that definitely get in the way when it comes to you losing weight and struggling through this yourself. So if that's something that you'd like, then please click on the link below and book in the brainstorm chats. Now, I love to do these and offer as much insight and available knowledge as I can for free of charge. It's not something that I hold back on. I don't sit there and go, oh, I'll tell you how, I'll tell you how, I'll tell you how. For me, it's just I give you back. Because a lot of the time, my coaching experience over the last 8 years has been, I've worked with people that after 2 to 3 weeks, things clicked, and they don't actually need real coaching. They just needed some help. So I'd rather help the people that really need help, which is my favorite types of clients. I love working with them. And those that just need some correction, some detail, or maybe someone just to look at it from a different perspective and just to give you a couple of tweaks to make it work again for you, I'm 100% down for that. So if that's you, if you're thinking that would be beneficial, make sure you reach out and let's do this. Thanks for watching for the How to Stop Dieting podcast, and I'll speak soon.